it's a great pleasure to have him here. I'm going to go now and deal with various chores, so I won't have the pleasure of listening to this lecture, so I rely on you to tell me all about it later. And hand over to Bev.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And the first thing I have to do is to congratulate you on two things. One is arriving here and not drowning on the way. And the other is, as Michael told you yesterday, phonetics can be defined as the science of speech sound. Anyone who learns a language is willy-nilly, as we say in English, going to be a phonetician, whether they like it or not. And you can either choose to be a good one or a bad one. And I think that since you've come to join us on this summer school, you've all made the right decision. So congratulations for that as well.
Thank you.
Now, I'm going to tell you some fairly straightforward and elementary introductory things in this lecture. For many of you, I think you will be familiar with what I'm going to say. Some of you may not be. And for some it may be a reminder of things which you've learned in the past. I'm going to talk first of all about the choice of a pronunciation model. So, there we are. I have two screens in front of me, one works and the other doesn't, so I have to pick the one that didn't. So we're going to choose a pronunciation model. And for this we choose what can be termed a prestige accent, sometimes termed an acrolect, a high variety of the language. A prestige accent is a rather special thing in as much as it's not attached to any geographical area. It's a social accent rather than a regional accent. In the English prestige accent, referring to pronunciation only, if you remember, this was the second use of accent that one can make. So confusingly, some terms can be used in two ways. This is accent in the terms of a variety of pronunciation. And it's traditionally known as received pronunciation. Why received? Received it's because it means socially, or meant socially acceptable in the Victorian era. I have a book on my shelf, which I found in a second-hand bookshop in the late 19th century. It talks about the received way of setting your table for dinner, the received way of having a visiting card, even the received way of getting your servant to take somebody's hat and coat at the beginning. And it doesn't actually mention received pronunciation, but you can see how this archaic use of the word has come about. It's almost always shortened by linguists and phoneticians to RP. It's often called by other names. It's wrongly called Oxford English. Well, if you go to Oxford, you'll hear all sorts of English, including some very strange accents and some very weird pronunciations. That's just the students. The locals also have a very rich local accent. And whilst it's true that if we take the Queen's English, that's the name, another name for it, that the Queen does speak RP, albeit a rather outdated, old-fashioned variety, I don't think that even she believes that it's exclusively her property. Though quite possibly the Duke of Edinburgh does. Perhaps with a little more justification, this speech is referred to as BBC English. Indeed, one of the two very good pronunciation dictionaries available uses that term. I'm not all that keen on it, I must be frank, because BBC English was indeed, and perhaps is still, the type of English which you're most likely to hear from presenters and announcers. Nevertheless, nowadays a great many other regional accents of English and even world accents of English are to be heard on the BBC airwaves, particularly on the World Service, if anybody listens here to the World Service. I expect some of you do. And the BBC, in fact, now has a declared policy encouraging this development. I shan't say any more because we're going to get a talk from somebody at the BBC who knows a lot more about this, obviously, than I do. Now, it's notable that linguists don't consider prestige accents like RP to be especially beautiful or melodious, although one finds that the general public often do. I would sometimes find that Americans have a great admiration for RP accents, and sometimes distressingly so. When I was in Spain some years ago, I met up with some Americans, an American lady, and she asked me how many languages I speak. And I'm not actually particularly good at speaking languages. If anybody has had their name mispronounced by me, then you know what I mean. And so I always usually start with a little bit of humiliation and say, well, I speak English virtually perfectly. This lady didn't understand at all. She said, oh yes, you do, you do. And I had to spend several minutes trying to explain what I meant, and the more I explained, the worse it got. But things are. In the 20th, oh yes, I must also say about RP that a great deal of work has been done on it. So it's very well described. It's probably the best described at the moment, I'd say the best described accents of all. Perhaps the accent I'm going to refer to, the American English accent, is nowadays has even more work done on it. But it's had a very great deal of work done on it. And even this is true even though the number of speakers is fairly small. One estimate was 3%. I think it's rather more than that. I think it's about 5%. And if you take the number of people who speak something related to RP, then it would be bigger again. But it's still a minority, very much a minority in Britain. In the 20th century, actually, frankly, the whole concept of received pronunciation has a somewhat dated feel. Traditional RP has now lost a great deal of its former unassailable position, and increasingly one finds it's regarded by many as a somewhat quaint, archaic form of speech. Although I didn't start out that way, I now consider myself to be an RP speaker. But nevertheless, I recognize that maybe I'm getting to be regarded by some younger people as something of a dinosaur. Exactly a year ago, I went to the Edinburgh Festival. My wife comes from Edinburgh, and we have a little house there, so it's a very nice place to go. And the Edinburgh Festival nowadays has an infestation of what are known as alternative comedians, stand-up comics. I discovered, actually, going there, that many of them weren't particularly comic, and several of them couldn't stand up. But I was there, and I was very tired. I'd had a hefty time the night before. I went into the back row, because I didn't want to be picked on by the comedian, and I fell asleep. So I woke up to find this comedian talking to me. It was like a nightmare, except I was awake at the time. And then we indulged in this repartee, and of course I had to respond, and I did respond. And at that point, the comedian, who was a man called Dominic Holland, said, it's my misfortune to encounter the poshest heckler in the whole of Edinburgh. So that was the point that I thought, well, maybe, RP isn't such a social advantage as perhaps it might one time have been. The other interesting thing about RP and received pronunciation is that at one time it was a term only used by linguists. But nowadays you come across it quite frequently in the newspapers. It's ironical that the more you find it in everyday language, the less phoneticians seem to want to do with it. Now, so therefore, a number of different names have been chosen for this. So we find that, for instance, go on. We have received pronunciation, I've talked about already, BBC English. We also have a term which I invented together with my colleague, non-regional pronunciation, NRP, which we use in our books. I rather like this term because I invented it. it doesn't seem to have caught on. What does seem to have caught on is this last one here, Standard Southern British English, SSBE. And you'll increasingly find people referring to this. All these terms, like NRP, SSB, etc., really refer to a wider interpretation of the model, so as to take in the changes that have taken place recently and the fact that it's no longer the exclusive property, as it once was, of the aristocracy or the very rich or people who had been educated at Oxford or Cambridge University and prior to that had gone to public schools. So nowadays, a wider interpretation, no matter what name you choose for it, a wider interpretation is being taken, as compared with the traditional books of Daniel Jones and even the book which is still in print and recommended you, actually, an excellent book it is, the book by Gimson, revised by Alan Crappender, called now Gimson's Introduction to English. Now, apart from that, of course, England, Britain is not the only country where English is spoken. And in America, one has far more speakers than we have in Britain. And furthermore, you have there a prestige accent of English, which is called, by many people at least, General American. This is the term English British phoneticians use for it. Some Americans dislike the term General American for whatever reason. And another term which is used is Network American. This reflecting the fact that in the United States, even if you're in a place which has a local accent, like the States and the South, then you will hear very often, if you switch on your television or listen to your radio, you will hear General American. This fairly non-regionally defined accent. All you can say about it, it's vaguely northern. So this is General American, which is the pronunciation model used for American English. The many different world varieties of English, Australian English, New Zealand English, Canadian English, etc., are all of these, and Network American, or GA, or General American, whichever term you want to use, or RP, or NRP, or SSB, or whatever it is, all these different varieties of things. The interesting thing about them is that they're, at least in their standard forms, they're very similar. Although the differences are interesting, particularly to phoneticians, and I hope to yourselves, nevertheless, it's the degree of similarity which is far more striking. And in fact, we can say that English, as used by educated native speakers, and a lot of people don't consider this often, that it's readily understood all over the world. It's the Latin of the modern age, and is unquestionably the most widespread form of international communication that has ever existed. And you're privileged to speak it and to teach it to others. And I think that's quite a nice thing to consider. Right, I now want to move on to another aspect of this introductory talk. I'm going to talk about the phoneme, and I'm going to talk about transcription. First, I'm going to have a word or two about the question of transcription. Now, this is going to be one of the most important things which you do on the course. It's very useful. The commonest form of transcription we encounter is called phonemic, not phonetic transcription. Phonemic transcription is particularly suitable for a language like English, which has an appallingly complicated spelling system. Some people defend it, but I can't do that myself. There's an old proverb that God made our beautiful English language. Well, if he did, he certainly went to the devil to provide the spelling system. I sometimes say, because it does, as Michael said yesterday, it does have more regularities than people think. I sometimes say it's like English weather. It's not actually as bad as people claim. But today I don't think I'm going to use that. So I see a very damp audience in front of me. And English spelling is indeed full of inconsistencies, exceptions to rules. And so I'm sure you will understand that life is much easier if we have one symbol for one speech sound. And so I'm going to later on talk a little bit more about transcription and talk about it in a little bit more detail. Now, Michael again mentioned this briefly, the question of segmentation. When we listen to speech, we cut it up in our minds, we cut up the continuous flow of speech into smaller, meaningful units. There's usually a very good agreement between native speakers of a language how many segments there are in any particular utterance. The smart term for a bit of sound then is a segment, and that means literally, as I say, something that's been cut up. And the process is called segmentation. If you look at this diagram that we've got here, which is an elephant never forgets, you can see there that I can divide it up, going upwards into syllables, which I'll define in a minute or two, and then at the top we have phonemes. Now, we want to try to find out something about the syllable and something about the phoneme. I'm going to start with the syllable. For many people believe, in fact, that the syllable is a more basic unit of the human psychology in terms of speech than the phoneme. Syllables are the level between the word and the phoneme. They typically form, they're typically formed in the following way. That you have as the structure of the syllable what we term an onset, that is to say the consonants at the beginning. Then we have what is termed the rhyme. The rhyme is called the rhyme because it produces the rhyme in traditional poetry. The rhyme we can further divide into the nucleus and the coda. So there we have then the structure of the syllable in that way. Let's have a look at this in a little bit more detail. You can see here I have at the beginning a set of open syllables. By an open syllable, I mean a syllable which has no consonant at the end, no consonant at the coda. So there we have by and bay, for instance. But I can also have closed syllables. So bite and buys. And then I can also discuss the consonants, and we have here examples of two consonant clusters, as we call them. The term used for a string of consonants is consonant clusters. And we have two consonant clusters here, 3 at the beginning and 3 at the end. The maximum number of consonants you can have at the beginning of a syllable is, in fact, 3. The maximum number that you can have at the end of a syllable is, in principle, 4. And here's the structure of the syllable here. You can have as many as no consonants, and no consonants at the end either. So if I say the word I or O, then I have there merely a vowel. But I've chosen two words here, straw and twelfths, where you have, in the first case, 3 consonants, in the second case, 4. 3 consonants then, to remind you, in onset position, that's at the beginning of the syllable, and 4 consonants in final or coda position. Incidentally, I say in principle because very often one finds that these very complicated sequences of 4 consonants are simplified by elision. So when I say the word twelfths, and I'm not on my best behavior in front of an audience of phonetics students, then I'm very likely to say twelfths, and I leave the F out. I elide it, in other words. If there's very often these are things, two very good examples are fifths and twelfths, so these fractional numbers. And again, with fifths, I will leave the F out, but I have to say the th. I have to say the th if I'm going to sound authentic. Texts is another possibility, but texts, as I say, it will often just be a long S, and the T will be elided. So a lot of these consonant clusters can be simplified in that way. I now want to go on from the syllable, so I'm going backwards as it were, I want to go on from the syllable to the question of the phoneme. And I want to tell you, or in most cases I think here, remind many of you of the concept of minimal pairs and minimal sets. A minimal pair is a pair such as pill and bill, where you have a single sound which changes the meaning of a word. We can then get a whole set of words like this: pill, bill, hill, till, sill, fill, will, etc., etc. And from that we produce what we term a minimal set. I can also take the nucleus of the syllable, vowel, and then I have hill, hole, hell, hall, and heel. Oh, a nice set of words, actually. It's almost like a poem, isn't it? So we have another minimal set there. In the final coda position, then we have hill, hit, him, hip. And I could give you several more. I could, of course, use examples from your native languages, from your L1s, from your mother tongues. But unfortunately, since there are so many here, then I can't do it. But I assure you that you can do this for yourself and work out what the phoneme inventory, as it's called, the phoneme inventory is for your own language. In fact, it's a very good exercise to do that. The units of sound that we derive as a result are termed phonemes. You could quite easily have the whole of this course devoted to the theory of the phoneme. But we're not going to do it. We're going to have a fairly simple idea of the phoneme. It can be considered as the sound and building blocks of the language. I always associate it with meaning. I think this is the best view of the phoneme. And in that way you can get a reasonable definition of the phoneme as the phoneme is a member of a set of abstract units which together form the sound system of a given language and through which contrasts and meaning are produced. A rough and ready way of thinking about a phoneme is simply a sound which can change the meaning of a word. This is how one will usually be dealing with it. So, as I've said, by collecting minimal pairs, building them up into minimal sets, we arrive eventually at the phonemic inventory, the whole set of phonemes for the language. And the phonemic inventory of RP, English, is usually considered to be 44 phonemes, 20 vowels, and 24 consonants, as it's usually analysed. It would be possible to analyse it in different ways, and you would get then fewer phonemes. But as we look at it, as we consider it, that's the analysis we can use. And you'll find the full phonemic inventory for English in the handout which has been presented to you in your course members pack, and was also in that little practice booklet, that little green practice booklet, and I'm sure that your tutors have introduced that to you already. We'll come back to phonemic transcription later, but now you know what phonemic means in this context, the transcription which indicates the phonemes, and in principle nothing else. We can usually hear small differences in the way in which a phoneme is produced on one occasion and another, but not every difference in sound can actually change the meaning. All phonemes consist of a range of variants which are termed allophones, and that's on your handout. these can be thought of as a kind of, Michael talked about my work on Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones had this very nice simple view of the phoneme. He used to talk about it as a family of sounds. Family of sounds that all went together to make the phoneme. And like the members of a human family, they usually show quite a lot of family likeness. They have what is technically termed phonetic similarity. They sound similar and they're produced in similar ways. Sometimes the allophones exist apparently at random. We say in free variation. But more usually, the allophones are predictable in some way and can be specified by rule. Here, for instance, you have the chief allophones of English L. So you have here a clear L, as we call it, that you have at the beginning of a syllable as the onset, lead. You also have the possibility there of what is sometimes termed voiceless L, voiceless fricative L. That sounds in isolation like this. But as you pronounce it, if I say clean or please, then it just, even to you as non-natives, well, just sounds like an L in that context. And then at the end, in the coda position, we have dark L. We'll explain later in the course what exactly a dark L is. But this gives us, shall we say, some word like full, full. If I turn them round, they sound quite funny. If I put dark L at the beginning, at the onset, then we would have, instead of leaf, we'd have something like weef. In fact, a lot of, some accents of English, Scottish English, and much American English pronounces in that way. It sounds like a W to me, and I sometimes mistake what Americans are saying for when they pronounce initial L. If I put a clear L at the end, we have full. And many speakers will find, if you're German or French, for instance, you may in fact have tried to learn dark L to avoid that. But you don't need to worry all that much about it, in fact, because, for instance, Welsh English, if you listen to our excellent administrator, Molly Bennett, she comes from Wales and she pronounces clear L throughout, and she is very easy to understand. If I put voiceless L in the wrong place, then it would sound rather odd, because leaf would sound like leaf, and full would sound like fush. So you can see that even though there's can be quite a little bit of difference, then nevertheless the native speaker shrugs off these differences. They don't notice them. So we have here, as you can see, then in the case of the L, we have what we call complementary distribution. Each allophone is the complement of the other. We can see how they're arranged. If, once again, this is on your handout, the distribution of the allophones of L are shown there. So you have clear L before a vowel in things like Leslie. Dark L in told, or. Voiceless L in clean and play, baby. Now, I want to go on to mention some other things about phonemes. Phonemes are abstractions. They exist only in the minds of the speaker and the listener. Allophones are concrete, they're reality. Allophones can be described in detail, they can be measured by instrumentation. And so therefore, we often refer to an abstraction being made concrete, being made real, as being realized. So we will often term the pronunciation, the actual pronunciation of an allophone, the realization of a phoneme. In other words, the way in which this abstraction is made into reality. And we also have ways in which we can indicate the type of transcription that we're using. And here you have different types of transcription, and the way we show those in the bracketing. We show orthography, that's to say, we show ordinary spelling between angled brackets. We show phonemic transcription, just showing the phonemes, between slant lines. We show phonetic transcription between square brackets. We can make a further distinction in terms of phonetic transcription between broad phonetic transcription, which shows relatively little detail, and narrow phonetic transcription, where in principle you can have very elaborate symbols and very elaborate diacritics, these are little accent marks, so that you can show a tremendous amount of detail. But you know the funny thing, and that is that the simplest transcription is the most demanding and the most complex. This is ironical, because of course that's complicated transcription tells you a great deal. So if you're able to read and interpret the signs, I could get, shall we say, a word in a language which I've never seen before. I don't know, something like an African language, shall we say, Yoruba or something of that sort. And in principle, I should be able to read it. But I'd never be able to read perfectly a phonemic transcription, because a phonemic transcription demands a knowledge of the language. Now, you already have a knowledge of English, so you're going to find phonemic transcription easier to deal with than these other two, possibly, certainly easier than narrow transcription. That's only because you've built up, over the years of learning English, a knowledge of the English language. So, just a quick reminder then on the types of bracketing. We have slant brackets for phonemic transcription, square brackets for phonetic transcription, angle brackets for spelling, orthography. As is true of all aspects of language, grammar, vocabulary, and so on, phoneme systems vary from one language to another. And the greatest obstacle to learning the pronunciation of the foreign language is the differences between the phoneme systems. Now, there's no problem if the particular phonetic area in your mother tongue has more phonemes than the particular area in the target language. But if the reverse is the case, and the L2 you're learning has a contrast which your L1 doesn't possess, then you may have problems. In fact, I predict you probably will have problems. And you'll have to try to sort them out. Now, for instance, English has a relatively complex vowel system, with about 20 vowels in total. If you're coming from a language like Spanish or Japanese, which has a much more economical vowel system, Spanish, for instance, has 5 vowels and a number of diphthongs, then you're going to have difficulties with certain areas of English. So, for instance, if we take this very commonly used example here, we can say that in English you have 2 vowels in the close front area. So you have sin and sin, to give you a minimal pair. In Spanish, I will ask a Spanish speaker to produce it. So in Spanish we only have 1 vowel, which is, shout it out.
Sin.
Again?
Sin.
Right. So here then we have 1 vowel which has to be split into two sounds. And this is where the distinctions cause problems, and this is where your attention will have to be particularly directed. Now, I'm going to come back briefly to deal with transcription again. I deal with transcription all the time because I think the one thing which you will certainly take away from you on this course, I hope, is greater knowledge of English transcription and greater knowledge in being able to use transcription. And on this course, we shall be using transcription regularly. you will find that they're in two excellent pronunciation dictionaries, the Longman Pronunciation Dictionary, edited by John Wells, who was the former director of this course, and who is going to be speaking to you tomorrow, and he's been Professor of English here for many years now. And the English Pronouncing Dictionary, or I would often call the EPD, which is co-edited by Jane Setter, who is also a member of this course, co-edited with Peter Roach and James Hart. Now, these two dictionaries show both American and British pronunciation. So they show GA and they show RP. The main difference between these two varieties is that American English is rotating. R is pronounced wherever it's in the orthography, wherever it's in the spelling. So that you have a pronunciation here, I'll attempt to do it, the farmer's carts are in the yard. So an R is pronounced everywhere where it's in the spelling. RP is non-rotating. R is pronounced only before a vowel. We'll have more to say because it's a little bit more complicated than that. Sometimes you will find that English people will pronounce R where there's no R in the spelling, just in order to make things a little bit more complicated for you. But this is the basis, this is the main difference between the two. So this is what I wanted to say in my introductory lecture, covering pronunciation models, the phoneme, and the uses of transcription. I hope these basic principles, which you, I should imagine in most cases, I'm reminding you of, will help you to deal with this course, and also help you for the future. Now, yesterday, I went out with some of my colleagues and with Jack Windsor-Lewis, who is the doyen of the course, the senior member in terms of age of the course, even older than me. And I said, well, I don't really know some things. I said, I don't know what to say. What would you say here, Jack? What do you think I ought to do? And he said to me, dear boy, it doesn't matter what you say to them, providing you stop on time. So I've been a success. I've stopped on time.